We have reported many times about ASEAN meeting tomorrow, Ajahn Thitinan. What do you think we can expect from tomorrow's meeting?
Well, I think ASEAN this year will have to recalibrate all of its agenda, its priorities. Already we're seeing some meetings being postponed. A lot of meetings have moved online. I understand that Vietnam is trying to show some leadership and trying to adjust. I think the ASEAN +3 meeting is particularly important because if you look at the handling of COVID crisis, COVID-19 around the world, in Asia, in the Western Europe and the EU, the US, Northeast Asia has been seen as fairly effective and successful in minimizing and eventually containing and stabilizing the COVID crisis. So for ASEAN +3, ASEAN will need a lot of help. China is in a position to assist, I think, based on its know-how, its experience, its medical supplies, its resources. But South Korea also has done well here. And Japan, I think Japan recently has imposed measures of emergency, ruled flexible but still an emergency. So we don't know how much preparations or what kind of position Japan will be in to help. But certainly China, South Korea, this is something that I think ASEAN countries will be looking towards to assist them in their handling of the crisis.
Dr. Thitinan, in crisis like this, we of course expect ASEAN countries to have coordinated efforts in dealing with it, in the coronavirus in particular. But is it something that you have seen that have taken place, or something close to this kind of coordinated efforts among these ASEAN countries?
Not really, because Kuntepchai, the COVID crisis, COVID-19 is almost like every country for itself. All countries and all governments, all societies have been overwhelmed by the rapid outbreak and the uncertainty, the disruptions. So each country is having to grapple with it. I think that some countries, they had some lead time. They had some advance notice, that they could have made better preparations instead of waiting. I think a lot of people were just watching China in January and February. Even the EU countries were watching. And then once the virus made its way into Europe, into North America, and much of the rest of Asia, they were not as prepared. So for ASEAN, I think this is something that they were not prepared, like most other countries. But ASEAN needs to see this COVID crisis as a regional challenge, as a regional outbreak, because eventually, ultimately, if you look at the map, for example, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, they have porous borders in mainland Southeast Asia. So what happens in these countries can cross borders. Suppose that Thailand can stabilize the situation, but Cambodia and Myanmar cannot put it under control, contain it. Eventually, Thailand can be reinfected from migrant workers in those countries. And ASEAN as a whole, I think that ASEAN has been so successful in pitching itself as a kind of a single production base and internal market, very large, almost 660 million people, $2 trillion GDP. So the ASEAN success story is very much premised on economic success, on development and economic growth. So ASEAN has to somehow see this as a regional problem, regional challenge, and to try to come up with a more regional solution and response. Otherwise, it could really undermine and undo a lot of the ASEAN successes that we've seen.
I think all the ASEAN countries understand the severity of the situation. So why do you think none of the ASEAN leaders, came up and say, well, we have to sit down and work things together and make concerted effort to fight this together? Vietnam, as a chair of ASEAN this year, should have taken that role, right?
It's the ASEAN strength and weakness at the same time. This is a very diverse region, as you know, and the regional organizations of ASEAN, they have ways of working based on consensus, based on discussions, consultations. So it takes time for the 10 members to come to any kind of a consensus and agreement. It takes time for the bureaucratic machinery to get into gear. and they have to sound out the different opinions from different countries, from senior officials all the way up to the cabinet and the leaders. So I've said this and written about this that somehow for this crisis, ASEAN has to be much more responsive, and it has to be some kind of an accelerated, fast track response, because they cannot go through the normal bureaucratic channels, because the crisis is very much moving quickly, and we can see it's making waves all over the world, and Southeast Asia, I think, is just at the beginning.
Ajahn Thitinan, there's a report that Southeast Asian foreign ministers have endorsed the setting up of regional fund to fight COVID-19. Have you heard anything about this? And what do you think the regional fund should be used?
The regional fund, basically, we will need some kind of a financial assistance package. They call it bailout package. You can call it rescue package. Or stimulus package. Eventually these economies in ASEAN will need a lot of financial assistance, and this funding has to come from somewhere. So ASEAN itself, the 10 member states may not have enough of the funding of the resources to provide the necessary financial assistance to rescue, to cushion the adverse impacts, which will be medium and longer term for the ASEAN countries, different ASEAN societies. I think this is very ominous, something that we must worry a lot about, because a lot of people will be out of jobs, a lot of people won't have income. This is very grassroots. Low-income people will be most affected. And ASEAN, if they can come up with some kind of a regional reservoir of funding, of assistance, this is very much needed. But the question is, and we've had this experience before, back in 1997, 1998, the question is, where the money going to come from? Last time, I think the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, was a lender of last resort that came in, that stepped in, but with a lot of conditions that the region did not like. This time, we could see maybe a helping hand from Japan traditionally, but I think China will try to step up now. So we will have to see. The size of the fund matters a lot. It's having a regional fund is necessary, is essential, but also the size of it, the scope of it has to be sufficient to address what is needed, especially for people who will be out of jobs, and for the bankruptcies, for the people who won't have food to eat, and so on.
Dr. Thitinan, after this whole thing is over, do you think ASEAN will look at China differently, especially in relations to its economic dependence on the country? You were talking earlier about recalibration, the need for ASEAN to recalibrate itself, right? Its positions and everything. Do you mean that would also include ASEAN's relationship with China?
I think that we will see most likely an intensification of foregoing trends. So we can see already, Kuntepchai, that ASEAN is heavily reliant on China. And China is not just ASEAN. China is a main market for trade, investment, exports, tourism, for all kinds of countries in Asia and beyond. But for ASEAN, because we're nearby, China, I think the you call it dependence. I think the reliance will deepen. We'll see a deeper reliance on China, not just on trade, tourism, and so on, but in terms of bailout funding, in terms of economic recovery, partly because the EU and the United States will not be in a position to help out as much, because they also will be suffering. But we also have to bear in mind that China also will suffer from some economic damages, maybe even certainly slower growth this year, maybe even a recession, certainly first half of the year. We will see if China can recover in what shape and what form in the second half of the year. But China is also not in a great position, unlike the past, where it could lend a helping hand, nor is Japan, nor is South Korea. So this time, I think ASEAN will be very hard pressed, and ASEAN should try to help itself as much as possible.